La Matanza, the massacre El Salvador tried to erase in 1932. The mountains of western El Salvador ran red with blood. Tens of thousands were executed, not in war, not in battle, but in fields, homes, and public squares, their crime being poor, indigenous, or simply being there. This is the story of La Matanza, the slaughter, the forgotten genocide that shaped modern El Salvador, silenced a generation, and still echoes through its politics today. The land was never equal. To understand what happened in 1932. You have to understand what El Salvador looked like at the time. It was a country dominated by coffee exports, and by the 14 families who controlled almost all of the land. The wealthiest lived in mansions, the rest, mainly indigenous peasants and rural workers, survived on the margins, often on lands their ancestors once owned. There were no rights, no representation, and by the 1920s and early 30s, there was no patience left. Farabundo Martí and Uprising. Enter Agustín Farabundo Martí, a revolutionary thinker inspired by Marxism, anti-imperialism, and indigenous liberation, had traveled to Nicaragua, worked alongside and returned to El Salvador with a vision: land reform, justice, uprising. In January 1932, he and other leftist organizers, including members of the newly formed Communist Party, helped lead a rural insurrection in the western departments of Sansanade, and the revolt was brief. Poorly armed peasants attacked military posts and municipal buildings. Some local victories were claimed, but they didn't last. What followed wasn't a crackdown. It was a massacre. The slaughter begins. The government, led by General Maximiliano, responded with overwhelming force. Army units swept through indigenous communities and rural villages. Men, women, and children were rounded up, executed without trial, and dumped into mass graves. Estimates vary, but historians agree. Between 10,000 and 30,000 people were killed in just a few weeks. In a country with a population of 1.5 million, it was a genocide, and it was targeted. Anyone with indigenous clothing, language, or even appearance was treated as an enemy. Cultural erasure and silence. After 1932, indigenous identity became dangerous. People stopped speaking. No, they stopped wearing traditional dress. Whole communities abandoned their heritage to survive. And for decades, no one talked about it. La Matanza wasn't taught in schools. It wasn't printed in textbooks. It was silenced deliberately. The government continued under authoritarian rule. El Salvador's elite preserved their land, and the peasant majority went back to living under the same old system, only now even more afraid. A legacy that refused to die. Farabundo was executed by firing squad shortly after the uprising, but his name lived on. In 1980, when El Salvador plunged into civil war, a coalition of leftist guerrilla groups named themselves the Farabundo National Liberation Front, a direct link to 1932. For the fighters in the jungles, La Matanza wasn't history, it was the original betrayal. The moment the country's poorest was shown what power really looked like. Even today, debates over land, identity, and political memory in El Salvador trace their roots back to 1932. The massacre that shaped a nation, La Matanza, wasn't just a tragedy, it was a turning point. When El Salvador's ruling class made clear that rebellion would be met with extermination, it forced an entire culture underground. It froze reform for half a century, and it left behind a scar so deep that many still hesitate to speak its name. But remembering matters, because history doesn't disappear just because you bury it. Sometimes it grows beneath the surface, waiting to rise again.